it doesn't appear necessary that you have to hold that image in your head to remember things, but it seems like there might be some benefits or differences. It is not the image itself that is kind of necessary for memory, but memory would often create an image if you can see it. So it's not that I hold the image of my first car in my mind and that creates the memory for me. It's just more, I think it's the other way. It is more, I'm remembering I have a white car, my brain kind of just shows it to me. And so it seems like perhaps maybe if there's a little bit of a disconnect between the brain showing it you, it doesn't matter because you've just remembered it anyway. You're just not seeing it.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Today, I'm chatting with Mr. Will Duckett from the University of Cambridge. Will works in the space of mental imagery and memory.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start with just the basics. So we'd love to learn a little bit about you, the work that you do, how you got into the field, what you're doing there at the lab in Cambridge.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a second year PhD student now at the University of Cambridge. I'm in the Department of Psychology, and then specifically within that, I'm in the memory lab. So we have a whole bunch of different research themes, but our main thing we look into is sort of the subjective experience of memory and then how the objective memory performance is for individuals and things like that. So that's the kind of general theme. So recently I've been looking into sort of mental imagery across the lifespan and kind of just across the general population and seeing how perhaps a vivid mental image or vividness could relate to memory performance. And so how strong that image you have in your mind's eye could relate to you performing on subsequent memory tasks. So before this, I was at the University of York. I did my master's there it was an integrated master's in, it was a master's of science and psychology. And I did the neuroscience pathway to go and do that. And then I worked at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences unit for a little bit here in Cambridge. And through that, met my supervisor and kind of just toyed around with some ideas. But I was always interested in consciousness, and memory was also very interesting. And so what aspect of consciousness and what aspect of memory was always something that I had to try and hone in on. And then it kind of just literally came as I was driving one day, the idea of sort of how do people who can't picture things that well remember things? I know that are there any differences? And so it's something that's fairly recently, within about the past 10 years, been looked into. And so I thought I'd join in on that and try and contribute a little bit and see how vividness relates to memory.
Yeah, I mean, very important topic. And I would say probably one of the top areas that I hear from Aphantasics all the time, like memory is one of those ones I think that goes deep with people. It's deeply personal. And we do see this large overlap with things like SDEM, severely deficient autobiographical memory. But then there's really interesting things where, we know very many aphantasics who will say, I have a great memory for facts. It's just, the ability to visualize those memories that's affected. Maybe let's start at, the very basics. What do we know about the relationship between mental imagery and memory?
Great question. So there's been a lot of research into it across a whole different range of different memory tasks, even specific like visual aspects of memory or working memory and things like that. And on the whole, there have been some differences that have been found, and I'll touch on them in a moment. But on the whole, no matter what memory task we throw at them, even if it's considered to be like strictly mental, aphantasics are able to perform equally as well as individuals who report typical mental imagery, which is really quite interesting for those who do typically see things, because I'll ask people to imagine things like their front door or the color of their first car and things like that. And they will say to me that they remember it because they can see it. We hear things like saying, I vividly remember that, I can picture doing that, or I can picture the color in my head. And so for people in the sort of typical imagery, they find it quite interesting to think, how do you remember things if you don't see it? And on the converse, we have the aphantasics who find it really kind of difficult to imagine a mental image of their first car. So the research is still going on, but for the most part, we found that it doesn't really matter where you fall along this vividness spectrum. You still perform equally well across the board, which again is really important because anecdotally and in some new research I'm doing, we find that aphantasics seem to believe that their memories are worse, even though scientifically it seems as though there's no real difference. Some small differences we do find is a particular paradigm, so like sort of binocular rivalry. I wouldn't complicate it too much, but there's a tiny little difference that's there. And then also in terms of like really, really like intense visual tasks, trying to memorize really precise, complex visual images, there's some slight differences. And in sort of autobiographical memory, so like the memories that you have automatically going throughout your life of the events that have happened, people with aphantasia tend to sometimes have fewer details or miss tiny certain little bits. But on the whole, when it comes to memory tasks, if I get asked you to say memorize a list, aphantasia is not going to hold you back. And across many other tasks too, we find the same.
What you said that I think resonates a lot is this idea that people with imagery are like, well, how do you do it then if you don't do this? Because I guess it's been assumed that the image, the mental image, is like the source of the memory or how the memory is accessed. But obviously that's not the case for the people who don't have it, right?
Yeah, I mean, evidence with people with aphantasia, I mean, yourself, Tom, you're able to still remember things. You can still function in daily life. You still know where your car keys are in your home, I hope.
Most of the time, yeah.
Most of the time. There we go. So, in a way, it doesn't appear necessary that you have to hold that image in your head to remember things, but it seems like there might be some benefits or differences. But the main thing that we're interested in is perhaps not even like the objective side of can you or can't you remember it, but what is it like to experience memories across this kind of spectrum? So my research going forwards now allows people to type in and give free-form answers as to like what they think their memories feel like when they are vivid versus not, and how a memory feels to them, which I think is a really important thing that kind of gets overlooked quite a lot because we just usually look at like correct or incorrect.
Okay, so that is that subjective feeling of,
Yeah.
how of that memory experience. And you said that aphantasics seem to score lower on that, even if maybe their objective results are the same.
Hmm.
Why do you think that is? Is that just because they can't, it's not, you don't have that semi-perceptual experience of it, and that leads to like a disconnect or something like that?
It's a great question. It's interesting. So it would kind of suggest to me that people with aphantasia, whatever strategy they are using to remember things, is sufficient enough to be kind of almost blend in with people who report using visual methods. Now, there are certain tasks when like we present an object, take it away, and then have three options and say if I rotated that 90 degrees, what object would be correct. We find a difference that they're still as accurate but slower. So it indicates the sort of techniques and methods that they use within their minds, people with aphantasia, slightly slower at that, but they're still as accurate. So whatever technique that is kind of a little bit different. There is a kind of a bigger, sort of more broader hypothesis, I suppose I have, that it is not the image itself that is kind of necessary for memory, but memory would often create an image if you can see it. So it's not that I hold the image of my first car in my mind and that creates the memory for me. It's just more, I think it's the other way. This is pure speculation for me, by the way, but this is what I would love to research. It is more, I'm remembering I have a white car, my brain kind of just shows it to me.
Right.
And so it seems like perhaps maybe if there's a little bit of a disconnect between the brain showing it you, it doesn't matter because you've just remembered it anyway. You're just not seeing it.
I mean, I like the hypothesis because, one, it fits into the aphantasia paradigm, and it shows that the image itself isn't the source of the memory. It's not stored necessarily in that, imagistic format. It's being generated based on underlying whatever semantic or conceptual knowledge that,
Yeah,
has been
it seems
stored.
like there's some different sort of cognitive mechanisms going on with people who are less vivid. There is some research to say that perhaps they can remember things, for example, spatially, so where something was in a room versus what it looked like. Some people would suggest that people who are less vivid would be better at remembering spatial things. The jury's still out on that one, as again, we need more and more research on this kind of thing. But it could say that there's cognitive mechanisms that people who don't use their images kind of help them in a different way. So perhaps they can't remember the sort of the autobiographical things as well, but then they can remember where things were in a room better. So it seems like these different sort of cognitive mechanisms that go on have differences across the vividness and things like that.
Yeah, and then the other thing there is that with or without mental imagery, the approach to solving some of these tasks, just might be different. And those are kind of differences or techniques that just naturally arise based on, the conscious experience that people are having. Let's talk a little bit about, I first found you because of that, the preprint paper
Oh, yeah.
about imagery state, and state, not trait. This is
Yeah,
a
yeah.
fascinating concept to me. I think it resonates just based anecdotally on the conversations I've been talking about this for quite some time. So why don't you talk a little bit just about what that means, the work that you were doing, and some of the outcomes?
Yeah, so just a sort of a brief overview of this research I did. I essentially asked people to memorize objects within rooms or spaces like parks and things like that. And then later on, show them the object again and had either presented a few changes. So either they changed visually, spatially, or not at all. And then got people to rate how vivid their memory was before that. So rate how vivid their memory and how it was in their mind. Got them to identify any changes and then how confident they were. And then we could see basically, does that vivid mental image you have beforehand relate to actually subsequently identifying the change? So what we found was that we recorded people's VVIQ scores. So the Vividness is a visual imagery questionnaire, which is used for over 50 years now to define aphantasia and things like that. We normally find that VVIQ isn't related to memory performance. So it doesn't matter if you score really highly on this questionnaire, your memory could be really great. It could be not so great. I also need to preface this before I get into any of the results that I've done. This is still a preprint. We are still going into publication and things like that. So none of this is fact, and I'll kind of talk about it in terms of the research that is already out there that's supported kind of what we've been finding so far. So there's plenty of things out there that we found that it says, yep, the VVIQ isn't related to memory performance. And then we found the same thing, that when we looked at the VVIQ and then correlated with people's memory, we found basically nothing. It was more or less a straight line that you could be high scoring on the VVIQ, and you could be terrible at remembering things, and then vice versa. And then what we did then, we created the average score from these vividness ratings beforehand. So then we could find basically on average, how vivid would you say your memories were? And again, much like the VVIQ, we find it was a little bit of a steeper line, but it was basically no correlation going on there. So then we thought we could use some now sort of more nuanced statistical models and things like that, which basically could look in the individual person. So make kind of almost like a correlation for an individual person, how their ratings would then relate to them getting it correct. And we found that so what we would call is the state. So in that moment, how that memory felt on that specific trial within the task, we found that their vividness rating did significantly relate to them subsequently getting it correct. So the more vivid people felt they remembered these objects, the more likely they were to have got things correct, which is a relatively new finding. From what I can go out and find, there's not been too much, specifically within mental imagery and memory into this. But it does seem to suggest that vividness does kind of relate in this state moment versus sort of the trait things we have like the VVIQ, which is in general, how is your mental imagery? But the state within the moment seems to relate to getting things correct and your memory and things like that.
One of the key things in there, and this is what I think one of the criticisms that I've heard of the VVIQ is like, what does this word vividness mean in this context? Because it's kind of like a subjective, it's a subjective thing, you know?
Subjective, yeah. It's really interesting. It's a great point to bring up because one, we don't actually have an agreed upon definition of vividness. If you look in the dictionary, things will refer to like clear and bright, but that's sort of vivid in the sense of like colors and things like that, which may very well be what we constitute as vivid for some people. Other people and like Aphantasics I've spoke to define more as a vivid memory as an emotional one. So they can remember the emotions and then perhaps they're particularly excited or particularly sad. That's a more vivid memory to them than something that's sort of an everyday mundane experience. We have also kind of ideas of almost embodiment. So if you can feel all the senses back in the moment, it feels more vivid. So if I can remember a birthday party and I can remember the sound of everyone around me, the smell of the candles, and remember the sight of the birthday cake, versus if I can just sort of picture, I don't know, an image of my bedroom, that could be more vivid. So yeah, there's no defined definition of vividness, which is also something that I would love to, as an outcome of my PhD and the work in the lab. But also we have this wider project within the lab called When Memories Come Alive. So they are looking at sort of vividness across the whole general population. So obviously Aphantasics still fall within the general population. They're just a subset of it. But they very much discuss sort of what do we mean by vivid? How can we measure vividness? And again, I think we're also still working towards a definition of vividness. And on that note, there is a survey at the moment that they're running, basically just asking everyone, what do you think vividness means to you? And from that, hopefully they can boil it down and see what everyone says and come up with one sort of definition.
Yeah, because it's kind of the key. It's like the keyest pivot point on a lot of
Yeah.
this type of work, because like you said, some people can mean like the integration of the senses, and it's this really vivid experience. But an aphantasic will say, well, I have a vivid memory because it's like very specific and I can pull up the details.
Mm.
And so, they might, so it's one of those, yeah, I'm glad to hear that the lab is doing some good work on this, because I think it's a
Yeah.
critical piece.
It's really interesting because too, we all know what we mean by vivid memory. We use it in quite often, but we don't actually, when we come down to think about it and state how we feel about it, we don't actually really know. There's also a debate about sort of confidence and things too. When I say I vividly remember doing something a week ago, could that also just mean I confidently remember doing something a week ago? So that's something we also looked into and want to try and tease apart and see if there's a difference between the two.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So let's talk more about the trial versus the overall kind of score, I guess, between the set of trials, right? That's kind
Mhm.
of the main difference. How do we make sense of this in a more general term? So, is it that people's memory scores are higher on specific instances of memories versus a general kind of memory trait? Is that, I guess,
Yeah,
memory
I think
specific? Is that the way to think about it?
it's slightly a combination of, I think the VVIQ is great and has been used for 50 years and such, but it is, again, a general thing. And the questions it asks and the themes it touches upon may not necessarily relate to memory directly. Like, for example, being able to imagine a rising sun, which is one of the questions within it, may not necessarily touch on and tease apart what we look for in memory. But then on that same token, when we average these scores, we also found nothing. So even when I did ask them about their vividness for memories, it still didn't find anything. So it seems like it's still this very specific within the moment of this specific object or factor or whatever else you're remembering. It is within that moment how vivid it feels to you seems to be important to then subsequently getting it correct. I think all the other measures we have are perhaps too general to be able to state if someone is good at or bad at remembering something.
Look at visualization as it's like either you have it or you don't. And
Mm,
I think that's like far too simplistic of a way to look at it, because we can see that there's wide variance in the experience of mental imagery, just generally speaking. Some people, can have almost movie-like clarity of, the images. Some other people have, they have mental imagery, but
mm.
it's maybe just comes in flashes, or they're vague and dim and things like this. But even that isn't a stable trait, because the vividness, again, back to that word, but the vividness of particular memory might be more vivid because it's more important, or for whatever reason it's more salient in someone's mind compared to something else. So
Well, yeah.
even though there's variance in the imagery experience, like from person to person, any one person can have a variance in that experience from day to day, or idea to idea, memory to memory.
I mean, even within the questionnaire itself, the first question I think asks about remember a familiar face. Now, you could have chosen your partner that you saw that morning, or you could have chosen your mum who lives on the other side of the country who you haven't seen in 6 months. So even then, it can still kind of be influenced by those kinds of factors.
Let's talk a little bit about what are the type of memory tasks, what kind of memory is that, and how does it differentiate with something like autobiographical memory, where we do see some real differences. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what are the different types of memories that people have. How do we categorize them?
Yeah, so there's usually about three main types we have. We have procedural, which is kind of your memories for like doing physical action. So learning how to ride a bike, for example, would be considered a procedural memory, which progressively improves and gets to a point where you will all remember also, perhaps when you had your first driving lesson or were first on a bike, you were focusing, remembering to hold the handlebars correctly, pedal around and everything. But now as soon as you're in your car or on your bike, it's just second nature. So that's kind of what we call by procedural memory. We then have episodic memory, which is our memory sort of, kind of episodes within our life, like different scenes and sort of autobiographical within that. And then we have sort of like factual memory and things like that. So like knowing the capital of France is Paris. I remember that, but I just don't really have to see anything. So we have those kinds of memory. But when we look into sort of the autobiographical side for Aphantasics and things like that, that's where we kind of I tend to find some differences. So I think a lot of studies have looked into getting people to describe their autobiographical memories and then scoring them on sort of detail and aspects and things like that, and find that aphantasics, on the whole, are perhaps less detailed in their recall. This, again, might not necessarily be the fact that they don't remember it. They just, when they talk about it and represent it and write them down, they just don't include as much. There's also, as I mentioned, the sort of spatial thing. So when we test for where things were and sort of changes in colors and things like that, there's also some slight differences. But yeah, there's quite a lot of variety of memory. I mean, then we have also the different senses. So we have vision, smell, touch, so on. I and most other people now are looking into visual memory, but then there's also a lot of research going into sound, so sort of like music and things like that, about people's memory for music. The people who can't picture music in their mind or sounds or don't have an internal monologue, are there any differences? And there's also more exciting research there. Memory is fantastic in that we can test a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of stuff to test, so it's quite broad. But at the most part now, for the most part, it's kind of autobiographical and sort of incredibly precise visual tasks where we find some differences. And as I mentioned, sort of mental rotation tasks and such like that, they're slightly slower. Like the reaction times are a little bit lower, but that's just for that specific task.
The episodic memory, the memory of your own life, perhaps we can remember details, but when we're asked, or maybe when we try and tell those stories, there's less detail in those stories. Do we think it's because those details come with the image of the memory? Is that, I guess, then the implication of that finding?
Yeah, to go back to kind of like my idea of like, I don't know if it's the image that's creating the memory or the memory that creates the image. It would sort of suggest it's the other way around, that you have to have that really strong image if I'm describing a life event that helps me to describe it more. Perhaps whatever is happening under the hood that we don't see in our brain is sufficient enough to give detail and that our memories are accurate. But when it comes to detailed and the subjective experience of like different aspects and colors within that memory, perhaps maybe there's a slight difference there. The jury's still out, and there's probably some research out there already, but not off the top of my head that I don't know.
It's like it's like the image is almost like a reference. It adds like these additional details that maybe would take time to conceptualize, that don't come out in like the flow of a conversation.
I mean,
while you're doing
one of the
task.
fantastic findings that we was in, I think, 2020 by Adam Zeman, asked people kind of a bunch of different questions about aphantasia, and then on the opposite end, hyperphantasia, where their mental images are so strong it's as though they're back in real life. And basically found that people with aphantasia overrepresented in science and STEM fields and things like that. But then we find that people with hyperphantasia, so those strong images in their mind, are overrepresented within arts and things like that. So it does make logical sense that if you want to paint the White Cliffs of Dover, you'd have to be able to see it in your mind. But then in the same case, we didn't see that any aphantasics sort of stopped themselves from getting into the arts field. It just seemed like there was a benefit to the people who were hyperphantasic. So again, there's perhaps a suggestion that these two different ways that your brains work lean themselves to help in one way or the other. But again, it's fascinating because it doesn't stop anyone from doing it. It just seems to be a bit beneficial in some areas.
Yeah. The other kind of interesting thing that comes to mind now is your point that, well, if that line is flat and the vividness doesn't impact those the scores on the memories, that means that people can be having vivid images, but those images aren't any more accurate. Like, what's that experience like? That's just, as an aphantasic, that's very interesting, because it seems like there's more content, right? There's more. There's that whole idea that the image is worth 1,000 words. But what's the quality or content of these images if they're not actually increasing the accuracy on these type of things?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it'd be fantastic to also look into sort of what we call false memories, where it feels like you remembered something completely correctly and it kind of came from somewhere, but it was in the actuality completely wrong. It would be something that would be great to manipulate. Has its methodological issues, but there's definitely ways you can do it. But basically, to get people to remember something, see it in their mind, both think it's really vivid and they're confident that they're correct, turns out it's not correct, would be a great way to look into it. There's no, as far as I'm aware, research saying that aphantasia does or doesn't protect you from having false memories or anything like that. My hunch would be that there wouldn't be a difference, but again, I don't know the research in that field. But yeah, it would be another fantastic thing to look into, of like, how could people have the opposite, a really strong vivid memory being correct? Because we mainly have focused now on the aphantasia where people don't have an image and they are correct. if we flip it around, that would also be really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, like those cases where there's vivid imagery, but low correctness. It's like
Yeah.
what's driving that? Very, very, very interesting. What's next for you? What's next for the lab? Where does the kind of research go from here?
Yeah, so I've got a couple, I mean, with your thanks to you. We are currently running an experiment with Aphantasics, which is really exciting. So we can get a bunch of qualitative data about what it's like to have memory, and then we can also use this to sort of compare with the previous people we've looked at before. Going forwards, I do have a new sort of exciting experiment that I'm looking forward to coming up sort of before the end of the year. I can't share too many details on it at the moment, but we would be looking to recruit people in about a month. So anyone who would be sort of local to Cambridge and Aphantasic we'd love to have you. If you would be interested, can I share a link? Is that permitted?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Absolutely, yeah.
of course.
So I have tinyurl.com, so all lowercase, tinyurl.com/cam aphantasia. So cam, C-A-M, aphantasia. That'll take you to a form where you can sign up and say you're interested in taking part in the study. You can fill out some details, and once we're ready and doing some more tests and things, if you're willing to commute to Cambridge and things like that, we'll be in touch. And then finally, for the lab as a whole, I mentioned this When Memories Come Alive project. So this is a much bigger project. It's part of many departments like history, English, and psychology. And they're looking into kind of like Vividness in general. How is it represented across like history? How is it represented in works like Shakespeare? But also the psychology people are going to be running some experiments there. And currently they have a survey where we want to find out what vividness means to people. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, it's a quick survey. I think it's about 10, 15 minutes. Find out all about what your experiences, your memories, and then what you think is vivid. If you're interested in any of that, it's When Memories Come Alive, Get Involved. So if you put that into any search engine, When Memories Come Alive, Get Involved, it should be a Cambridge URL, and you can fill that out if you're interested.
But yeah, that's great. And for anyone watching, I'll put the links to that, in the video description after, and I'll share it in Discord and everything, so people can learn more and find you. Yeah, really great work. This relationship between mental imagery and memory it's complicated, but it's super important because it's one of those areas that goes deep with people. It's, part of how they remember who they are and what they've done. And I think it's one of the big areas where people feel like they are missing something because you can romanticize the idea that how nice it would be to visualize, a lost loved one or, the places I've been in my life. Like I hear many, many people, and myself included, feel sometimes like this is one of the areas where I do feel like there's just that even if the performance-based outcomes are the same, there's something subjective in your conscious experience that is you can romanticize and I think many feel that way.
Well, the current sort of experiment, again, we've not collected all the data, so I can't make any conclusions, but just from eyeballing it, most people, the aphantasics we've looked at, said that they on average believe that their memory is worse than the average person. Now again, I can't look at the data just yet, but I would assume, like we found before, it's going to be no differences. But then two, I ask if people would like to be able to see images if they were presented with the option. And a lot of times people mention things exactly as you just said. That'd be great to be able to see a loved one or see their favorite childhood toy or place or something like that. It would be that subjective experience, even though the objective, sort of the cold thing of like, yes, I got it incorrect or incorrect, the subjective feeling of the emotions and everything else would just be sort of amplified by being able to visually see it. So again, it's another, I think, aspect of memory that is really important to look into, the subjective experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and people's relationship to their memories and things. Because,
exactly.
I mean, just, pure, just thinking off the top of my head, but it does feel like you could be maybe more connected to those memories if you had a sensory representation of them, right? And we've talked a lot about the visual aspect of memory, but they can be more than just visual. It can be, you briefly mentioned the sound, but there's the smell, the taste, the touch. To smell what it was like to be in, I don't know, a grandparent's home or something like this is one of those. Grandma's cookies is one of the the things that you hear in pop culture.
Spell's one of those particularly salient ones that is quite tricky to study, but people always report having a smell that takes them back to certain memories and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll open it up then. Thanks for the conversation, Will. If there's
no
anyone,
worries. Thank you.
who has questions for Will and the work they're doing there at Cambridge, feel free to throw them in the chat. I had a question about language, and can it be pieced apart from other parts of memory?
Yeah, so absolutely. As I mentioned, memory has many, many facets within it, and visual memory is just one of them. When it comes to language, linguistic memory is also another thing. There's some more above. I'll do a little
We'll get,
summary.
I'll find it while you do that.
Yeah. But yeah, linguistic memory is kind of another thing that people are looking into. It kind of falls somewhat in between the episodic and the sort of factual or semantic memory that we call it, where you don't necessarily have to see something, but you can remember sort of language or a list without having to visually see it in your mind. So it can definitely be pieced apart. And there's a whole different field of linguistics that go into that. But there was a big debate for a long, long time throughout, I think, the 70s did we actually visually hold the visual information, or did we just create linguistic representation? So did I, for example, remember seeing a teddy bear on a table by seeing it in my head, or did I just have the words in my head that said teddy bear on a table? And largely, it's still debated, but there kind of was a conclusion that no, we do have the visual things. But yeah, we still do tease it apart. And from what I know from certain Aphantasics I've met, they also report that their memories, instead of being visual, are more linguistic, like stage directions. So it's definitely something we can piece apart from other parts of memory.
Yeah, because the way I would describe it actually the phrasing came from a member of the community, is this idea of like a dispassionate reporter talking about, the things that I've done in my life. It's like, that's kind of, so for, for at least from my experience, it seems more language. And I've always had, I've had this conversation a few times trying to I try and just think about how would I express or experience my memories if I, for example, didn't learn a language. Like I don't know what the answer to that is, because it seems like if I didn't have the language but I had images, I could still experience them, with visuals.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like telling the story using the language is what makes the memory real. It's what turns it just from, in the ether in my mind into something that's can be as close to I can experience it, let's say.
Yeah. Is there any evidence that vividness of an experience is related to the likelihood of retained autobiographical memory? It seems as though from the research, I don't know of any that have been like sort of quasi experiments where they've kind of gone and interviewed people following an event and assessed their vividness and how accurate their memory was towards it. I would say, based upon the controlled laboratory experiments and such, it would seem that the vividness of your event doesn't necessarily matter. But the likelihood of retaining an autobiographical memory, I would say it is almost like the vividness and the emotionality behind a memory is what forces you to remember it. So you won't remember something as mundane as maybe your walk to work or your drive to work because you've experienced it tens, hundreds of times before. But in fact, if it's something particularly salient, so if you happen to go and somebody else fell off their bike and you saw it out the window, you probably remember that because it's got kind of emotional and a bit more vivid and salient. So I don't know off the top of my head anyone who's done sort of quasi experiments like that, but it would seem like it's perhaps not a vividness as we're making you remember it and it feels more vivid, if that helps.
So because it stands out from the rest of the memories, there's something more salient about it.
Yeah.
That
And because of that, it'll be more vivid.
people rate it more vividness because of that. Such an interesting area. Best of luck, and as you continue this work, I hope many more Aphantasics participate.
Yeah.
And thanks for the conversation.
No, thank you. I'm very happy for anyone to be in touch. And again, I'm very grateful, as we all are at the lab in Cambridge, for anyone who's willing to volunteer or anything like that. But thank you again, Tom, for your time. I really appreciate this opportunity and for all your help with all the other experiments and stuff. And hope we stay in touch. It'd be great.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.